Good afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series and in partnership with the College of Education, Health, and Society, we present our Changemakers event, Fantasy Sports, More Than Just a Pop Culture Pastime. Joining us for today's conversation are the Dean of the College of Education, Health, and Society, Jason Lane, Associate Professor of Sport Leadership and Management, Dr. Brody Ruihley, alum Matt Gaulis, and current student Luke Sawhook. Welcome to you all, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. For our audience, some questions were collected during registration, and our panelists will address some of those throughout the webinar today. You'll also have the opportunity to ask a question during the live production by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your screen. Please notice that in the interest of time we have available, we may not get to every question, although we will certainly try. And with that, we will turn it over to the group to get us started. Welcome to you all, and thank you.
Molly, thanks so much. We are thrilled to have this panel today to kick off this year's Changemaker webinar series to really talk about an emerging area of interest, I think, for a lot of folks on this call and across the country and frankly around the world. And that's fantasy sports, which has really, I think, shaken up the sport industry in a number of ways, but not just the industry itself, but I think in the way that we socialize with each other, the way that we engage and build community, whether that be within our business space or our friendship spaces or other communities. And so we've got a great conversation today with one of the faculty members in our SLAM department, one of the alums of Miami who's really doing some great work in this space, and one of our current students who is a leader in thinking through fantasy sports. And so just to give folks a sense of the size and scope of the industry, by some estimates, back in 1988, there were around about 500,000 folks who were engaging in this space. Fast forward to 2017, which is where we have the most recent data, that number has skyrocketed by some estimates up to about 60 million individuals. Most of that is in what we would call fantasy football, right? And that's the American version of football, right? The NFL football drafts that are happening right now, but it's not just that, right? We've seen sports from baseball, basketball, hockey, golf, even esports. Are out there in the fantasy space for our colleagues around the world. The other version of football, or as we call soccer, a lot of interest right in Europe, sort of in the fantasy space with soccer. And there's even about 5% of the people who I mentioned earlier who are doing fantasy bachelor by the survey, right? And so I think that's the gamification of the Bachelor and Bachelorette out there betting on what's happening on that show. So somehow we're now thinking about that as fantasy sports, and maybe Brody, you can unpack that for us at some point. But this is really something that has touched a lot of different aspects of society in an area where we're really trying to think about what is the future of this space and what is the role of higher education in understanding this space and better articulating what's happening within it, for those who are involved in society as a whole. So I want to turn it over first to Brody Ruihley to help us understand, what is the evolution of fantasy sports and sort of where are we today in this space?
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me on this webinar. My name is Dr. Brody Ruihley, and I'm an associate professor in sport leadership and management and assistant department chair of our new department in sport leadership and management. So this is my research topic in my research field, and got this started really with my dissertation work, and very pleased and happy that my Ph.D. advisor, when asking me what to study or what I may want to get into in my dissertation topic, when I mentioned this relatively new activity that's taking off, I'm so thankful he did not turn me away. And so this has been a really nice research line where I study the motivations of participants. I study consumption and sport consumption, and then even the industry as a whole. And so I do work with the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association and present just about once a year at their winter conference, present some academic research and some ideas that I may have or that I consult with their leadership with to present to the group. And so this evolution of fantasy sport really took off in the mid-90s, and that's with the advancement of the internet. there were a lot of local games, and people would play in their own groups that you could get to, or you could drive to a draft. And believe it or not, you would mail in, stamp and mail in your picks or your trades or a free agent pickup, or you would just have to call it in. And that has changed dramatically with the internet, because now we can do everything automated. Everything is right there for us. And so really in the mid 90s, when we saw that 500,000 go up to several million people. And the beauty of this industry is that it's creating amplified fans, amplified consumers. And, we think of it as a niche industry, or we think of it as only a certain few people playing. And it took a long time for the ESPNs, Yahoos, CBSs of the world to catch on and say, wait a minute, these are the consumers that we want. There was actually an ESPN report in 2011 that showed ESPN consumers that participated in fantasy sport were consuming ESPN products at 3 times the rate of those that did not participate in fantasy sport. And once advertisers and marketers saw this and understood this, then it became more of a mainstream area. And so really, the amplified fans are a big part of this and how it's evolved into something extremely big. We see that, we're consuming games that we normally wouldn't consume. How many of you in the room that participate or even on this call find yourself watching a random 49ers Seahawks game when you don't care about those teams, but your running back or your quarterback is now involved in that? And as Dean Lane mentioned, there's so many different variations of fantasy sport and play now, where we normally would think of fantasy sport as season long. There's now daily fantasy sport, which really took off in 2015-16. And if you watched any television, statistically and research has shown, you saw a daily fantasy sport ad around every 30 seconds. They flooded the market with advertising for daily fantasy sport, which is really redrafting your own team each day. And so that really has evolved. And of course, now, as we'll talk throughout this hour, with the legal evolution of sports betting, now we're starting to see a lot of convergence between traditional fantasy sport, daily fantasy sport, and sports betting. So there's a little bit there of the evolution. I can go into it further, but we'll get into that in the next hour.
Brody, thanks so much. That was, I think, a great overview and helpful to understand how this has all evolved and changed. And I want to bring Matt Golis in now. Matt is, by some bios, a serial entrepreneur. Somebody who spent a lot of time in sort of the business creation, entrepreneurship space, and worked. I think you're also known as the payment guy, having worked and co-founded Yapstone, a payment firm. But you've made this evolution now toward more fantasy sports, and in a very interesting way, right? Not in the way that I think Brody talked about, which is the ESPN. How do we get folks to consume more of our goods? But you've set up a platform to actually leverage fantasy sports in a way to support nonprofits, right? And in a way that is allowing us to engage perhaps in a more altruistic way, than we might sometimes think about this fantasy sports space. So can you talk a little bit about your evolution with fantasy sports and how do you got to this space now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So after a pretty long career actually in Silicon Valley, which was most of my time in payments, after moving back to Ohio about 4 years ago, coincided with the launch of a platform called GiveGame. And, the original premise of GiveGame was really, how could we make giving a more fun and engaging activity? And in putting on my payments hat, what drove that was, if you've ever been to a nonprofit's website and they would have a bunch of fields on the form for like ship to and bill to address that didn't even apply, and you just want to give $10 to $25 to the nonprofit. Why is this so difficult? Like, how can we make this fun and engaging and simple? And so for me, the first thing that kind of came to mind was, how could we use like fantasies like engagement to almost gamify giving? I mean, that was really the original premise of it. And ironically enough, because I myself have played fantasy sports, I've actually done a little bit of daily fantasy as well, the ease of the gameplay with that was the first thing that came to mind. Now, what we actually learned over time was is that, you know, for a lot of folks that are not spending the time on the research on fantasy, you know, it can kind of come off as almost overwhelming. You know, they want something that's very, very simple. And over time, we realized that we had to simplify the game so you didn't alienate folks who just want to support the nonprofit and have some fun. But for Give Game, fantasy was just the engagement mechanism. It was something where we started with, you know, the big events like March Madness and the Super Bowl, for instance. And then we realized that we don't have to just gamify, you know, the big events, but it could be every week of the NFL. It could be a golf tournament. It could be the Kentucky Derby. It could be anything. But it was always with the spirit of when you make your picks effectively, you would be donating to a nonprofit. And then the fun came in when the actual event kicked off, and then you could watch the leaderboard to see how your choices did. So the fundamental premise was, and this was extremely important, and Dr. Brody will appreciate this, is that we had to walk a very, very fine line of not being construed as a gambling operation where a contestant was enriched in any way with a prize, but rather that this was simply money that was going to support a nonprofit where we had a fee every time someone used the platform, but ultimately all of the money was going to support a cause, a 501c3, rather than going into a player's pocket. So it was not designed to attract like shark players or people, you know, who are trying to game the system to win money because they weren't going to win anything. It was just to get groups of people together with a common interest in supporting a cause. Ironically enough, we found our biggest sweet spot for that was actually employee giving. So imagine, you know, versus United Way style giving where it's pulled out of your paycheck, let's say every 2 weeks. With this, now we can play against our coworkers, have some fun in the office, not have to go through the hassle of Super Bowl brackets, you know, or March Madness brackets, Super Bowl squares, things like that. But just do this, let's say, every week as a way to kind of have friendly competition. It builds camaraderie, it builds, you know, goodwill amongst people in the office. And again, from an HR perspective, it was just kind of a nice employee amenity to offer. So, but funny enough, to your earlier point, we did end up gamifying major reality TV shows like The Bachelor, Bachelorette. So asking questions like, you know, who's going to get a rose this week? Who's going to, you know, who's going to get kicked off, what have you. And then also Hollywood award shows. So all of these things where you what was unique about it is you had a predetermined set of options. So they could be multiple choice. They could be a bracket. They could be a pick'em of which team you think is going to win this week. But ultimately there was going to be a finite answer within a certain period of time. So within 3 to 4 days, we would know what the answers are. But before that event, let's pick which choices we think will happen. But whenever you make picks, it just has to go to a nonprofit. So you're absolutely right. It's an altruistic way to support nonprofits, but the gamification was critical to make the engagement and the ability to share, by the way, freely on social media. Because when people would play and give, they would encourage their friends who follow them, let's say on Twitter or friends on Facebook or Instagram, et cetera, to actually play and give and make it this more of a competitive, the more people that played, the more competition, hence the more money that went to the nonprofit. So.
You sort of talked about this in the way of, you know, the traditional campaigns, the annual giving campaigns for employees, right, that are more sort of behind the scenes, right? Sign up now, give your $5 a month, whatever that might be. This is a much more active and engaged space. You know, do you have a sense of, is this also part of a changing nature of how people want to give in addition to how they want to commune?
Well, absolutely. I mean, like, again, if you were to ask anyone, let's say in the workforce or even not in the workforce, who's under the age of 30, I mean, would they put up with that online credit card form to support a nonprofit? Probably not. You know, and quite honestly, when it comes to things like the United Way, I mean, that model, which may have worked, you know, 25, 30 years ago, you know, when you kind of had, let's say, your boss who was kind of guilting you to do it just for their participation rate, you didn't have any personal affinity towards the United Way. One of the ways that we would actually offer the platform is that either everyone played to support a single cause, like let's say the American Cancer Society, Heart Association, whatever it might be. But the other model, which was really cool, is where every employee would pick what cause they wanted to support, and they would make their personal contribution effectively to the collective donation of their pot. But then whoever scored the most points and won that game, the winner's nonprofit got the entire pot. So now you can have somebody who's like volunteering, let's say at a cat clinic on the weekend, and they're only paying for $25, but because they effectively won the game, the cat clinic's getting $1,000, which is awesome. So it's a very fundamentally different model where you could actually tailor who the ultimate beneficiary was to the player in a way.
Right.
Rather than having people feeling like, oh, I have to give to this cause because this is the cause that my company wants me to give to, that I personally don't have any connection with.
Right. And the benefit then is that you're better, if you win, you're maximizing your contribution back to that.
That's absolutely right.
Right. Okay.
Yep.
So let me bring in Luke then, and we'll come back to this conversation, Matt. But Luke is a student at Miami, but I think that's maybe his night job. If you look at his Twitter handles at all, right? He's a content creator at Mojo and fantasy football analyst and social media manager and a ranker and a partner. And Luke, you're sort of out there doing lots of different things and really setting a new path for what it is like, I think, to engage in this space, right, which is fantasy sports. And so can you tell us a little bit about, how did you get involved in this space? And, how do you see it evolving, just sort of collectively and for you as a career path?
Yeah, absolutely. And first and foremost, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on here. But I actually originally got involved in fantasy sports pretty much directly from Miami. I'm now the president of the fantasy football club here on campus. And I joined that club as a freshman. I went to Mega Fair like a lot of other freshmen do, solely looking for the fantasy football club. I signed up. I was elected president my freshman year. And then from there, over the summer of 2020, like a lot of people, I was bored, discovered that the club had a Twitter account that had been dead or hadn't been touched in a while. So I got on there from the Fantasy Football at Miami Twitter handle. I don't use it anymore, but I did use it for a little while there. Gained a couple hundred followers, made some polls, made some content, asked questions to the community and whatnot. And then from there, I just randomly shot in the dark, interacted with somebody who worked at Dynasty Nerds, which is a Dynasty fantasy football podcast and website, one of their senior writers. And I asked them if they were looking for any interns to try to get my foot in the door for social media work. And they were. And then from July 2020 until now, I still work for them operating their social media. I run the Twitter account for Dynasty Nerds, which is now amassed, I think, 38,000 followers. So that was my foot in the door. So when I announced that I was working there in my personal Twitter account, I gained a few hundred followers from the fantasy football community up to like 600 followers on my personal Twitter account. And then from there, I decided to really just jump into it and start making content. So, from there, I just started, putting out my opinions, my takes, my analysis, my research. Started writing articles for websites wherever I could, doing podcasts, guesting on people's shows, doing my own shows. It's been a lot of iteration and throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what stick over the last couple of years. It's been a grind every day. It's to the point now where last month I tweeted 3,000 times in the last 28 days. But the growth has been tremendous. I had my best month I ever had last month. In August, I gained 4,000 followers on social media. I've been able to leverage it into a lot of different job opportunities. My newest one being Mojo, which I think Dr. Ruihley will find very interesting. It's a new betting platform that is only in New Jersey right now. It's a sports stock market where you can invest in shares of athletes and they go up and down based on their career performance. It's really interesting. But yeah, that's just one of my other jobs. But yeah, I kind of got directly involved from Miami University, and then over time just made more connections, got more experience, got more reps in. And then I hope to one day leverage it into a full-time fantasy analyst position once I graduate. So that's the goal, making as many connections as possible, doing as much as I possibly can. I've had like 5 internships at once for the last year and a half. It's been total chaos, but I love it. It's a great time, and it's a really big part of who I am these days. The community is incredible on Twitter. Fantasy football Twitter is an amazing space where you meet all kinds of great people. I actually just went to the Fantasy Football Expo, which is an in-person meeting with a lot of different analyst, and I actually got to talk to Andy Behrens from Yahoo Fantasy, and I told him I went to Miami, and he actually asked me if I knew Dr. Ruihley, and I said yes. So that was cool. Yeah, that's kind of the spiel on how I got started in the fantasy space and where I want to go. But Miami,
I love that it went back to Mega Fair, right? At the very beginning, and of course, Miamians who have come through know Mega Fair. That's an opportunity to get involved in student organizations.
Our club is actually still doing fantastic. We recruited 200 incoming freshmen at Mega Fair this past weekend. Wow. And our first club meeting is actually tonight, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, and just I want to highlight something you said at the very beginning of this, right? You were looking for an internship and you went out and asked. For our students who are listening, I think there's a great lesson there. Don't be afraid to ask. Go out there and
yeah, just real quick, actually, pretty much I would say 80 to 90% of every position I've got is from a connection that I've literally just cold Twitter DM'd people. It sounds crazy, but it's worked for me way better than LinkedIn or Handshake or anything. Just actually making the connections with people on social media, even in a more casual sense, has worked really well.
So, Brody, let me pull you back in on this conversation. Luke, jump in too, and of course, Matt, you also. But reflecting on Luke's, well, actually, Matt, your engagement too, right? This is such a nascent space in terms of companies coming around, the evolution of what it means to be in fantasy sports right now, that, we're seeing an emergent, I think, sector, right, happening. And so we don't even know what it means yet to pursue a career in fantasy sports, because it is so sort of evolving right at this point in time. And, where are we in that emergence of fantasy sports as a business sector versus, when do we begin to tip toward more mainstream, or we'll begin to find some more common sense of what this will look like as a business sector?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And part of it goes back to the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, which used to be the Fantasy Sports Trade Association. Their whole existence is to protect the industry and protect those that are in it. And so you might have a small operation of, 3 to 6 employees writing or providing analysis or creating a draft magazine or whatever it may be, or you can be DraftKings and FanDuel and ESPN. And those companies all come under that umbrella and that, not protection, but that guidance of this particular trade organization. And so since the creation of this industry, they've always protected each other. They're always trying to grow the entire industry. And in several interviews, they always say, let's grow the pie so everyone can eat. Let's, a rising tide lifts all boats, no matter how big the boats are. And so that's something that's really important. We saw, especially during the daily fantasy sport boom in 2014 to 2016, a lot of organizations start, and not all of them made it. But the beauty of this industry, as Luke alluded to, is that everyone's kind of looking out for each other. No one's trying to really, I believe, take down one another in this industry. Now, there's connections made where we've even seen one of the biggest analysts and stars of fantasy sport, Matthew Berry. He started at NBC, went to ESPN, made a household name of himself, left ESPN in the last few months, back with NBC. There's no hard feelings there in terms of those things. And actually, if you want to know about the state of fantasy sport, Matthew Berry is going to be on Jimmy Fallon tonight. But anyways, it's an industry that protects each other. And as we do see the entrepreneurial spirit, as Matt knows, folks that want to get into this, one of the unique aspects of the association's conferences is they have what's called an elevator pitch. And this is my favorite part of the conference, where people will get up on stage. They have 3 minutes or 2, depending on the year, to give an elevator pitch of what their company is doing, how they're starting off, or just what their idea is. And everyone's in the room listening, and they make connections then. And so they give that voice and that platform to the upstart businesses that have a new idea or an add-on to a product or something along those lines. And so that has been happening for many years, and it's such a unique aspect. And I will say this about that association one more time to keep plugging it, but that's where Matt and I met. And those of you in the room that are alumni, you know this. You wear this M anywhere in this country, people will see it, and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, that's my university." And that's how Matt and I met. I was wearing a quarter zip, a Miami quarter zip, and Matt came up and said, "Oh my gosh," and we've created this relationship since that point. So always a good plug to promote, your alumni and your institution.
Before we jump to the other two, you talked about protection in there, Brody, and could you unpack what you meant by protect? Because at some level we could think about protection of making sure that there's a broad tent, right? Everybody has an opportunity. Yes. On the other hand, we can see protection meaning we want to protect those who are already the insiders, and we don't want to let anybody else in, right? Because we want to protect what we have. And so could you talk a little more about what you mean by protect and where the association is in that space?
Sure. So protecting them in a lot of different ways, but this has been a roller coaster with the legalization of fantasy sport. And so before, 2016, 2015, you did not speak of gambling terms. You didn't say anything about risking money. You didn't do any of that because you didn't want to fall into sports betting which was illegal at that time. And so it would be a lot of different seminars, a lot of different talks about how do you protect yourself in your business? How do you go to a bank and explain what you do? Because in those days, going to a bank and trying to get a loan, explain fantasy sport, sometimes you were hitting a blank wall of like, I have no idea what you're talking about. We're not giving you any money. So protecting people those ways, protecting your payouts. A lot of organizations have to make sure that when they take money in, they protect their payouts so they can protect themselves in terms of paying out winners and not getting in over your head in terms of that money and trying to invest it elsewhere during the time. So every year there's panels about the law side of things, how you can do things in an appropriate way, keep your organization safe. And then I say protecting those smaller companies, because it would be very easy in any other industry for those companies to be wiped out just by someone saying, I don't want them around anymore. And they don't do that. We don't do that in this industry, where you try to protect those smaller organizations that maybe don't have the reach or the financial resources as some of those bigger companies.
So, Matt, let me bring you in on this conversation, because you are a serial entrepreneur. You spent a couple of decades out in Silicon Valley, which is known for everybody trying to edge their way out, right? Beat the competitor to the big idea. Compared to your other experiences, where does fantasy sports fit right now in that evolution of startups and maturation and, bringing new people in?
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of things. So like with Give Game, I mean, the problem that it was trying to solve probably wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't for some of the incumbents, right? And this is what Silicon Valley is all about, is new startups disrupting the incumbents. If the traditional ways of online giving were archaic and somewhat arduous for people to again do something as simple as giving $10, $25, that was one impetus for it. I think the other thing was the rise of social media in general. So if it wasn't easy for you instantly to tell your friends that I made a donation and I had fun doing this and you should try it out too, and let's make this kind of one-on-one personal challenge kind of competition at the same time. I mean, social media as a technology has enabled that in a way that before social media, it would have been really difficult. I mean, you'd pick up the phone or call someone or send them an email and say, hey, you should give to this cause I just gave to. But the instantaneousness of it, being able to immediately see how many people are in the game supporting the cause. I mean, all those dynamics and the engagement just are things that technology has made possible. I mean, just for the same reason that, the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world wouldn't have been successful if the iPhone hadn't existed. So there's a timing dynamic to when it was the right time to introduce a concept like this, when those types of technologies are prevalent. But there's another aspect to this, and Brody started to touch on it, which I think is a big thing around, and this is kind of this crossover between fantasy and sports wagering now. So there has been such a historical stigma with the sports betting, the wagering side of it, because of the necessity of offshore operators and the fact that, state by state legalization was happening at different points in time. And so there was this whole aspect of, hey, like to the Matthew Berry example, like we can't talk about some of these things on TV because, federally it's still illegal and until states open it up. And now for a whole variety of reasons, the revenues that it can generate has become super attractive to states, and that's created a sense of urgency to do it. But overall, just from I would say a cultural perspective, I feel like every year the stigma is starting to go away. And I think even with daily fantasy kind of growing out of online poker, and when online poker, had issues with its operations, and a lot of the people that did that pivoted into daily fantasy, there was still an aspect of this is gambling, but there was this is a niche, and they kind of got sort of a carve out where they were able to operate. But now, when you start seeing like online sports wagering shows and fantasy shows on network TV, not just on cable, I mean, it's not just even on ESPN. I mean, you see these even on network television now. I mean, it just tells you that the stigma is absolutely going away. And now, to Brody's point about the value of that ESPN viewer who does fantasy versus ones that don't, I mean, they're recognizing that, hey, when people aren't going to stadiums because I have this ultra HD TV at home and I don't want to have to pay the high tickets and everything. And by the way, I'm now watching that, 49er Seahawks game because this one player is in my lineup or what have you. I mean, this is literally, in a lot of ways, people would argue fantasy has kept sports relevant because, attendance is down in about every sport except football and maybe basketball. And so this is what has kept the engagement. It's one of the reasons why the TV rights are so high, is because if people weren't watching these teams for players that they never used to care about, I mean, they could never support the revenues from commercials anyway. You could talk about that forever, but I think this over time, this evolution of the destigmatization of the betting side of this, that this is not just getting together with friends and picking our favorite players, and now is something which has absolutely been legitimized over time, has made a profound impact on culture.
That's a great point. And let me turn out a couple of questions from our audience. And, Marie asked, what do you think the average age of those who participate in fantasy sports is? I've got the stat here, and my experts will correct me, but 50% of about 50% of them are 18 to 34, although the average age is 37.7. So it shows you really, it cuts across generations, I think, in a number of ways. The other stat, though, I'll say, which may not be overly surprising, about 80% are male. Self-reported here, 19%, are female. So and we just have that dichotomous response rate. But, to show it really does tip toward the more male aspects right now. Oh, another question, though, fantasy is the key word here. But are there real life impacts of fantasy sport on individual players and how they play as part of a larger team? So Luke, maybe, if you want to answer that, but also if you have anything to add about sort of what's it like to move into this emergent economy or sector of sport too, feel free to add in.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the anonymous question there about, how it impacts how fantasy impacts real life and everything. My favorite example right now is running back for Los Angeles Chargers, Austin Eckler, who completely leans into fantasy football and the fantasy community and the fantasy space. Like, he posts videos of him, like, in the gym lifting weights, like getting ready to carry your fantasy team this season. Like, he fully leans into it. And I'm pretty sure he has an organization now that does a little bit of charity work with fantasy sports, if I'm not mistaken. But there's other players too who get interviewed all the time who hate fantasy sports because, they don't want to worry about the fake performance. They want to worry about their real life performance. But it's really deeply ingrained in the culture. It really is. I mean, people are thinking about it. It's a good example, too, if you want to think of another fantasy realm like Madden ratings, for example. Players completely love finding out, like, how their speed ranking compares to everybody. Like, these players care about the fake games, even if they say it or they don't say it. It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy seeing players like Austin Eckler lean into the fantasy football side of things, get asked questions about how his fantasy status is going to look, how his teammates are going to be this year, who he's going to draft, Keenan Allen or Mike Williams. He said Keenan Allen, by the way, if anyone cares. But it's a lot of fun to see players actually lean into it. And yeah, just to touch on what you said there as well, the emergence of different sectors of betting, of DFS, seeing all the new gamification and whatnot, it's really, really interesting. As somebody who's been involved with companies like Underdog Fantasy, which is a rising daily fantasy and pick'em kind of website, it's been really cool to see that emergence of that as well. But the gambling thing is the thing that I really want to touch on just real quick. We're not even scratching the surface of the full potential of the sports gambling industry, because it's not legal in every state yet at all. It's not even close. And once it's going to roll out in the further states, it's coming to Ohio soon, we'll just see a deeper and deeper ingrained sports betting culture in our sports TV shows on ESPN and Sports Center. I mean, I bet we'll see betting lines sticking across the bottom of the screen all the time. It's a lot of fun. And one more thing about the real life too is on DirecTV's NFL Sunday Ticket package, they have some might be familiar with NFL Red Zone, where it cuts to every game. There's a different stream dedicated now to like fantasy Red Zone. Essentially, it's all about fantasy points, which is really, really interesting. But I think Dr. Ruihley had something to add as well.
Yeah, and as we make that pivot there, Brody, let me bring in another aspect of this. And we can't talk about fantasy sports anymore without talking about betting, right, and gambling. And Luke is right. It comes to Ohio, I think January 1st, is when it legally will become available here in the state. There's a potential downside also of this in the real impact of fantasy and sport betting, particularly, you think about people who are betting live as they're watching games. And, if you are losing your bet because of the performance of a particular individual, right, that concern, right, could be triggered, targeted at that particular individual. And I think we've heard stories of folks that are, take out their loss of a bet, right, against those who are playing the game, which can be the downside of this whole space. So, yeah, can you talk a little more about the real life implications and what maybe the downside of this could be also?
Yeah, I think, we can go down a discussion of sports betting and some of those downsides as it relates with fantasy as well. Luke, you were kind of touching upon it. I remember Eli Manning one time had won the game for the Giants, but he threw like 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, had 200 yards of passing, but he won the game. And he was being like booed walking in and telling him, you stink. And he's like, I just won the game. And, but they were looking for the extra. And this is difficult with fantasy and sports betting, because then all of a sudden we see athletes as products or commodities or stocks that are up and down, right? Like you just even mentioned, Luke, where we're seeing them just for that performance. And it's an unfortunate reality. And as we dip into sports betting, it's important to realize that we are different from other countries in the fact that we have an immense amateur sports system in college sports that will garner a lot of attention for sports betting. And now all of a sudden, that person that did not hit 22 points in the game or complete so many passes, all of a sudden they're in my class, or they're a student it's in a class with another student, and all of a sudden they're more accessible than professional athletes, right? Professional athletes are adults with a full-time job, and they aren't accessible. College students are, and so I think that's one potential downfall, Dean Lane, that we need to see how this plays out in many different ways, especially on college campuses, because those students are so accessible. And if I may add, just one more thing about the real life component, I think this is all real because of the community that's built around fantasy sports. So I had my draft of my longtime fantasy football league last night. And so all of a sudden we're all getting around, we're chatting, we're in the chat, we're making calls before and after. My dad participates in fantasy sports, so he has something in common with his boys, right? And we have something that we can chat about, and we do. I called another buddy after the draft and just to talk about what happened in the draft, and we hadn't talked in months. And so it does create those real life connections with people. And so I think that's a really important component to that as well.
Well, it seems like sports used to be the thing that kept communities together, particularly as people stayed in certain locations, right? I'm from St. Louis, so always a Cardinals fan, but I'm not in those conversations as much because I'm not there, right? Whereas folks who are in that community, that's more the water, cooler conversation. If I have a conversation about the Cardinals around Cincinnati, it isn't the same conversation, right, that I'm used to having, right, with the Reds fans. So, I think, fantasy sports recreates that in a different way, particularly as people are more, have moved, right, and are more spread out across the country. We had another question from Leighton, and Matt, maybe I'll direct it to you first, because or from Nathan, and I'll go back to Leighton. But you began to think about sort of how do we lean into this idea of fantasy sports to bring people together, particularly around donations to the nonprofit. And so Nathan asks, do you think the legalization and growth of sports betting will help to grow the fantasy industry, or would you say that there is some risk that people start to lean more towards betting on games and individual player statistics?
Well, I think the legalization of sports betting is probably going to ultimately affect the daily fantasy industry, because the daily fantasy industry filled a void while sports betting was illegal in a lot of ways. So for the people that effectively wanted to gamble, they could do it that way. I think one thing that's interesting with sports betting versus daily fantasy is that in daily fantasy, you actually are playing against sharks. I mean, it is unbelievable. If you actually look at, the footer on DraftKings website that says you have an 82% chance of losing your money. And if you're a newbie, it goes up to like 90% or something. It is insanely bad odds to play.
And can you quickly just define what daily is versus the more regular play?
So the DraftKings and FanDuel models, where Brody mentioned you can pick a different lineup every time you play, you're playing against players who optimize and literally spend 10,000 hours a year studying statistics to optimize and get the best combination of players, versus if you're a newbie or, you just do it occasionally for fun. It's not like, taking a once a year trip to Vegas and playing, playing blackjack or poker and saying, oh, well, I have a 50% chance of winning, no big deal. No, you have a 20% chance of winning. So there's a fundamental aspect to that model. The thing that's interesting about online sports wagering is that you're effectively playing sort of against the house line so to speak. So you actually have, believe it or not, a closer to 50% chance of either winning or losing based on how you bet relative to losing because you're going against professionals in daily fantasy. So I do think that the growth in sort of the unlock of the legalization of sports wagering is absolutely going to affect the casual daily fantasy players, because now they've got another outlet if they want to have a little bit of skin in the game, want to have the ability to bet a certain way. I also think another reason is from a technology and evolution and business model perspective, online sports wagering can do some really interesting things with, let's say, parlays, where you can bet across multiple games, you can bet against multiple players. There's no equivalent to that in daily fantasy. So those are some of the most popular ways of participation, I would say, with online sports wagering, and obviously the ability to do it from your phone, from anywhere, wherever you are. I mean, all of those things I think are ultimately going to make it the much, much bigger market opportunity than fantasy. I don't think it'll ever take away Brody's experience, though. I think you're always going to have groups of friends who are going to get together to do their season-long draft. I mean, you'll talk, particularly as you get in your 40s, like some of us here, where there's a lot of people you ask, what's the highlight of the year or even just the football season? It's the draft itself. It's getting together with a group of friends. We're all busy with our daily lives. This is an opportunity for us to have some fun together and then have some interest throughout the rest of this 17-week season in the case of football. So no, I think the traditional season long will continue to grow in popularity because it is about camaraderie and getting people together. I think sports wagering is definitely going to, over time, diminish the daily fantasy model a bit.
Because
go ahead, Brody.
We need to remember, for a while there, daily fantasy had this loophole in law to where they could participate as fantasy because it still was a game of skill over luck as opposed to maybe, rolling dice. And so daily fantasy had this loophole for people to do this legally, risk money, wager money legally. And so now, as Matt was mentioning, sports betting being on in many different states, now there's more of that legal option there. And so I think that will eventually, put a dent into the daily fantasy market. And I'm very curious to see how they pivot. Now, we've seen DraftKings and FanDuel, they're sports books now. They are sports books that offer daily fantasy when they started as daily fantasy. And so they've already pivoted in a major way. But we'll see how that particular game of daily adjusts in the changing times.
Luke, you want to get on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just wanted to touch on Nathan's question about, do you think the legalization and growth of sports betting will help grow the fantasy industry? Absolutely. From an analyst perspective, someone who's, in college, graduates soon and trying to get a full-time job, I think more realistic landing spot for me is with a DFS or a sports betting company, just because they have a lot more money to offer analysts and offer people for their work, opposed to like the Dynasty Nerds website I work for, running their social media. They're just a podcast, and they have a website that has blogs on it, and they sell some like premium services, but for a lot smaller fee than like FanDuel and DraftKings and all these other sports books are making. So that's a way for analysts to really get the foot in the door. It's just infusing more money overall into the industry. So then it allows companies to hire more people like myself or other analysts out there and give them more higher paying opportunities, get more work, get more content produced for their companies, which in turn helps the fantasy industry and fantasy analysts as a whole. So yes, I think it is overall good news for the growth of the industry because it provides more content creators the ability to go into it full time, which in turn puts out more content for those to consume, which should in turn lead to further growth.
How do you think fantasy will affect amateur sports? The term we use it, right? We talk a lot about NFL and sports betting, right? And the professional leagues. And Brody, you mentioned a little bit about the impact on an amateur student, but are we going to see growth in fantasy at the amateur level? Is this, are we going to see more betting at the amateur level? What are your thoughts on that space?
Yes, to all of it. Yes. I mean, if there are games to be played, there will be bets on them. There will be wagers on them. The joke is always, when can you bet on the Hawaii game? Because it's your last chance to bet on Saturday night, right? Because the Hawaii game is going on at 3 a.m. for us, or whatever it may be. But I do think with amateur sports, it's going to be really interesting on how this plays out for safety of people, and for safety of gambling even too. I mean, the algorithms that sports books have to notice when something is off are incredible, right? It's probably second to credit cards, knowing that something's off. But so I don't know if we'll see too much collusion or unlawful wagers, or even bribes, or someone taking point shaving. But like I told you before, the access is so open for college students. I know in one of the questions it was talking about, will we see anything with licensing and player licensing, and maybe even NIL, name, image, and likeness. The one thing we need to remember with fantasy sports and sports betting is that statistics in real life games are public domain. And so that's been taken care of with legislation in the past, and actually fought really hard by people in the fantasy industry to make sure that stats remain public. Otherwise, a lot of those smaller operations would not be able to work with the players' associations associated with major leagues. And so I don't know if we'll see anything with NIL, with fantasy, or with sports betting, just because of the statistics being public domain there.
And we can't ignore the fact, right? Southwest Ohio, Cincinnati, Reds, Pete Rose, right? What a scandal that was 40 years ago, banned for life, right? And here we are having this conversation about betting on amateurism, right? And beyond the professional leagues, right? I mean, what a different space we're in today. I mean, how do you see betting? How are we different than we were, let's say, 40 years ago when that all transpired? But how do you see betting beyond what you've talked about, sort of with the potential impact on the individual, affecting the way we organize, right, around amateur sports or professional sports? Or is it going to have an impact on what happens, on the field?
I think it absolutely will. I think, Dr. Ruihley's already talked about it a little bit, but it changes the socialization of the way people watch games. I mean, I've done it myself with, daily fantasy. And when I was in New York this past summer, I bet on a couple games because it's legal there and I'm 21. And it makes things a lot more fun because you're rooting for different things in the game, right? Like, you can be rooting for the halftime score. So it just adds a different layer to how you watch sports, how people participate in watching the sports together as a group. I mean, there's several viral videos out there already where, a group of like 20 friends will get together and they all put a 50-leg parlay bet together for like $1, and they win like $8,000 and they all go insane. Stuff like that is definitely going to continue to happen and increase and grow. It just adds different layers to watching sport as a whole. So I think, with modern day sports betting, with the legalization, people are just a lot more willing to get in there, have fun with it, throw $20 at a bet with your friends and watch a different game in a different lens than you usually would, which adds an additional layer to the sports experience.
Yeah, I actually was at a Columbus Crew game recently, and one of the sponsors, and it was going around the stadium, was a sports betting sponsor getting ready for January, and the tagline was, "Let's make this interesting," or "It's about to get interesting," or something. And I'm like, I'm interested right now. But that's the whole idea behind it, is what else can we have on this? And this is a difficult and a slippery slope, because once you start betting on games, then all of a sudden watching with nothing on it isn't good enough anymore. And that becomes very difficult. That's a slippery slope. And so it's why there are many groups. We have a group here on campus working on problem gaming with Miami. And so we're looking at that, and studies will be done here in the next coming weeks about college student betting, because it's a real concern with problem gaming on that slippery slope. But you're absolutely right, Luke. Fantasy sports betting does change the way we view the game, and we can see things differently. If not because there's money riding on it, but just the fact that we know more about it. We know more statistics. We know that this person's batting .285 with 23 home runs and 89 RBI right now, and we never would have known that if we weren't so engrossed in our fantasy league. So it does change our consumption quite a bit.
So on that changing nature, let me bring it back to the community aspect of this. You've talked about this, Brody and Matt. You talked about it from a business perspective, and one of our viewers said, I'm a middle-aged mom. I've got a few years ago, we started doing fantasy football within our family so she could better connect with sons and her husband on this thing, football. Right? She's now obsessed with it, and it's been a great way for them to connect. Luke, one of the things I've been interested in reflecting on this, where you've talked about internships and you've talked about business and you've talked about getting into this whole industry, and you mentioned being the president of the club, but I haven't heard you talk about the community building. Have you had the community building aspect around this, or for you, is this as a student? This is a career opportunity, right? This is where I see myself evolving as a future professional. It's less about the whole community space.
Right. Yeah. It's been a merging of two worlds for me as someone in the space. So I go to school I major in emerging technology, business, and design, and I added the minor of sports leadership and management, or SLAM, just a year ago to try to merge the two worlds together. But I originally went into school for social media marketing, and that's what I still kind of focus on in school. And I just had an internship this summer, actually, with the polo I'm wearing right now, Hudson Valley Renegades. It's the New York Yankees minor league. One of their affiliates, the high A affiliate, same as the Dayton Dragons in terms of affiliation there. And I was operating social media for them. I'm doing social media for Miami University football this fall. So I'm tweeting out stuff for game day for them. So I'm still very much focused on that side of my profession. And then, that community has been huge. That's how I've leveraged a lot of my actual paid internship opportunities in the fantasy space. And I'm still growing into trying to get more paid analyst positions. But merging those two have been really key for me, because I've learned a lot about how to grow a community, how to really capture an audience's attention, and doing that for different brands, networking and doing all that. But the community aspect's been really important for me. It's a big part of my personal brand is, building a community, being yourself, being genuine, being around, being available and accessible. It's all about growing the consistent community, and being there every single day is how you grow. And actually, before we went live, you asked if I had any tips for people getting into the space. And my biggest tip is just to get started. For anybody who wants to do anything, anyone can do it. Seriously. I mean, I always say I'm good at what I do. I do a lot of research and whatnot, but anyone can do it. If you like football and you like fantasy sports, you definitely can do what I've done. Like, I've grown a Twitter account from nothing to 15,000 followers and paid internships in 2 years. It takes a lot of time and effort and commitment, but if you do it on a daily basis and consistent basis, you can do it. You just need to start. My quality of my work has grown tenfold since I've started, and then some. But that's the way it is for everybody. It doesn't have to be perfect. My content still isn't perfect, but just getting out there, making connections, and starting is the key to getting anywhere in this industry.
So, I'll use a baseball analogy here. We're rounding third, heading to home in terms of our time, right? And so as we're looking toward the close, we had a question from Nathan about, what does the future of the industry look like? And I think about our conversation. On the one hand, you've got this emergent sport betting, big business aspect of what's happening. On the other hand, we're talking about community, right? And Matt, you're doing work in the nonprofit realm. And how do we use this gamification to generate more money for the social enterprise? So I don't know, Matt, maybe you first. Can you talk about what is the next evolution? Where are we going with all of this and these varying sort of forces that are driving in sport fantasy?
Well, I think, again, from a cultural perspective, I think it's all the things that have been discussed. It's about the way we consume and watch, right? Like I was saying, in a lot of sports, the attendance in person is down, and people are looking at how can I watch this event on mobile or on TV at home or what have you, because the quality's better. I don't have to pay the high prices for concessions and so forth. And so, it's like we're using technology to consume this information, but because we're using technology rather than just being at the game, where if we missed the play and we didn't see the replay on the scoreboard, we want to be able to dig in and understand every aspect of what just happened, right? And maybe it's because I'm following a certain player and I want them to run in the touchdown versus, receive the touchdown or whatever it is. But it's I think just the fandom, the aspect of like COVID. COVID forced those social media accounts that Luke's talking about to explode, because when the teams couldn't play the games, the teams still needed a way to engage with their fan base, right? So it's like all the learnings that we've had even through that experience about, hey, I now have a relationship with the team because I follow them on social media, and I never would have had COVID not happened, right? So it's technology driving, I think, consumer behavior and I would say fan behavior in a way that outside of even fantasy and sports wagering, it has driven a whole new world. And then, you can get on to, are you going to have like AR, VR type experiences where, you pick a guy and it's hovering as you're watching them stand in the batter's box. They have 23 homers and 77 RBIs, and they do really well at night games against left-handers or whatever. I mean, you're going to have this immersive experience. And again, I'm probably putting on more of my Silicon Valley hat here, but I do feel like technology is going to drive it and push the envelope almost as much as just the legalization side of wagering and fantasy.
Brody?
Yeah, I think the consumption point is right on, Matt. Let's remember, really the one thing holding on live television right now is sports. That's it. We can stream everything else, and we've seen it, right? We can stream everything else on demand at our own pace and binge what we want to do. But the one thing holding on is live sports. And so I think that's a really unique aspect. As we evolve further, what does it entail? It's more access on our phone. We might see, like Luke was mentioning, the station that's dedicated just to fantasy sports, like Red Zone. But it's going to be all of our players. We input our players, and then we get a direct video feed of every one of our players' performances.
Now you're talking. I'm interested. I'm
interested too. And but then also think about this, and we'll see this with sports betting, which is kind of scary, but we'll be able to just be on our phone and live bet everything. What's the next play call? Is it going to be, a run or a pass? Is the next play in baseball going to be an out or a base hit? We'll be able to do that just with a touch of a button, which is scary based on, addictive personalities and things like that. But really integrating technology, integrating more community into these activities, I think will be the next evolution.
Luke, what do you see as the next evolution?
Yeah, kind of everything that Dr. Ruihley just said. The integration further into betting, I think, is going to be the biggest thing. As we said, the legalization of betting across all 50 states, that is inevitably going to happen, right? I mean, I'm sure there'll be a few that hold out longer than some, but it's going to happen. It's coming. It's already a huge industry as is, huge, like gigantic already, but it's going to become even bigger. It's going to be more deeply ingrained into our culture. It's going to be on more TV. Like Dr. Ruihley said, I would not be surprised at all if that exact feature he just mentioned, betting every single play is going to happen within the next 3 years. It already has live betting out there, on sports, if you want to bet on an NBA game and it's at halftime and the team is down that was favored before the game started, they're down by 5 at half, you can get better odds on the team that's losing, it already exists. And we're just going to see a further implementation and further iterations upon that. And that's what I think the next big thing is going to be, is just more in the betting world. I don't think there's going to be anything new coming out of left field that's going to completely turn the industry on its head that I see coming necessarily. But I think more betting and further iteration upon the betting, foundation and what that means for different websites and sports books and how they can implement it more into the new technology, like Dr. Ruihley said, is going to be really interesting.
Thank you so much, Luke. And we're coming close to 1 o'clock. And I asked each of our panelists to think about the fact we are in the fantasy draft period right now, as I understand. A quick tip for our viewers on this space. Anything you want to provide them a quick tip on?
I'll go first since my face is on the screen gigantic.
Okay.
Wait until at least the 6th round to draft your quarterback and only get one. You don't need two. Don't get two quarterbacks in your single, in your 12-team redraft league. When you start one quarterback, you only need one. Get Trey Lance late from the San Francisco 49ers. He runs the ball a lot, and that's all you need to be good. Jalen Hurts he had the most top 12 finishes of any quarterback in fantasy last year, and he was a top 5 quarterback before he hurt his ankle. Trey Lance is Jalen Hurts from last year with better passing weapons with George Kittle, Debo, and Brandon Ayuk and better coaching. So go get.
So clearly, we know Luke has the depth in this space, and if you want to find out more, you can follow him right there at his handle. More tips for you, Brody.
My tip is always seek out the experts. Seek out Luke. Seek out your favorite analysts. They do it for their career, right? They're the ones doing this for their job, and so seek out what they say about certain people. Even in your brackets for March Madness, there's a group of people that sit in a room and rank them 1 to 16. That's a pretty good indication of who's likely going to win those. But anyways, look at your experts, follow them. They're great at what they do.
Matt?
Yeah, I'll just say don't pick your favorite players and teams. You have to be objective about it, and just generally speaking, know that if you do want to play for money, I mean, once sports wagering is legalized, I would definitely recommend that over daily fantasy, because again, with daily fantasy, you have an 80% chance of losing if you don't do it all the time.
But better to play to help the social causes that are out there.
That's right.
Give back. So my thanks to Matt and Luke and Brody for just a great conversation, a great kickoff to our Changemakers webinar series this year. So gentlemen, thank you so much. And we hope to see everybody next month. I think the same time that we'll be doing this, and we'll be talking about the teacher shortage and how we are addressing the shortage of teachers that are out there in our community. So thank you all, and hope you all have a great day. Love and honor.